Oui, Afro-Africa TV, bonsoir. C'est un plaisir, comme d'habitude, un honneur de vous avoir aussi nombreux ce matin. Nous sommes le 6 décembre 2012 et nous sommes là au National Press Club Center sur la 14th Street North. United Nations Alliance of Civilization, qui lui est basé à New York. Et les journalistes du monde entier ici ont tenu à se regrouper pour voir dans quelle mesure le travail du journalisme peut être amélioré et dans quelle mesure, avec les nouvelles technologies, ils peuvent accommoder l'information vu la densité de la demande. Nous avions sur ce panel un bon nombre de journalistes. Nous allons citer ici George Akfen, qui lui est du National Club, professeur, planeur, catering and event. Nous avons le président Dory Maina, qui lui représente le journalisme et éducation. Nous avions Juliette Smith, directrice de OG News. Nous avons un autre docteur, Emmanuel Katan, lui du British Council aussi. Nous avons Cara H du British Council, qui est la directrice des digital media de ce côté. Nous avons Stéphanie Durand, qui, elle, est venue directement de New York et qui est Strategy Media Partnership Manager. Nous avons de UNA aussi. Nous avons Mathieu de la télévision du Québec Plateau. Nous avons Sarah, directeur de Membership Retention National Club. Nous avons Madame Barbara Cocheren de l'Université du Missouri et le directeur Mark Chua, qui lui également venait de New York, représentant l'association United Nations Alliance of Civilization. En bref, c'était dans ça le panel des représentants ici, mais il y avait dans la salle tous les journalistes du monde entier, de tous les pays qui étaient là, et chacun de sa façon a essayé de défendre la cause de son continent, de son pays, et d'autres ont essayé d'apporter des solutions, à indiquer des lacunes dans le domaine là où ils étaient le mieux formés. Et nous avons eu des histoires, des témoignages qui nous ont frappés et touchés également, ici, là, par l'histoire de l'Orient, bien sûr, la Palestine, Israël, ce qui se passe de ce côté du monde. Et puis, il y a bien d'autres qui ont parlé également de leur continent et de leur pays. De lutte éclair voulait, évidemment, j'étais là pour la cause africaine. J'ai défendu le fait que les médias ici aux États-Unis ne parlaient pas assez du continent africain. Bref, que quand ils voulaient parler du continent africain ou quand ils veulent parler du continent africain, c'est très souvent du côté négatif. J'ai dû demander à mes collègues journalistes ici s'ils ne trouvaient pas d'intérêt de parler de l'histoire, de la culture, de ce que l'Afrique a de beau à offrir, qu'à nous apporter ces images de détresse et de tristesse. Et j'ai par suite pointé du doigt le fait que le continent africain a quand même une forte diaspora représentée ici aux États-Unis. Et les statistiques dont les Africains, quand même, après, je crois, les Indiens, les premiers intellectuels ici de la diaspora. Et j'ai demandé s'il n'y avait pas pour eux un intérêt de parler de cette forte population qui regorge quand même un palmarès positif ici aux États-Unis. Et la journaliste, collègue exactement, m'a dit, nous a répondu que l'Afrique est parmi les continents qui sont en train de connaître l'expansion en ce moment, et que certainement l'évolution économique, développement de l'Afrique politique, économique et culturelle va certainement forcer les journalistes qui sont à se pencher de ce côté du monde. C'était en bref dans l'objectif ici de cette conférence, c'était de voir comment aborder le problème de la communication, comment accommoder le journalisme aujourd'hui avec la nouvelle technologie, les nouvelles stratégies, les nouveaux problèmes et l'environnement qui se complique dans le métier. Et toutes ces questions ont été jetées ici sur la table. Un début de solution a commencé à être débattu ici et bien sûr beaucoup reste à venir. Nous allons continuer. La prochaine rencontre sera avec les femmes américaines journalistes qui vont se tenir bientôt et dont la date nous sera communiquée par la sœur Barbara que vous voyez là. Qui représente le journalisme de l'Université du Missouri. Et c'était donc tout. Mon Afrique TV, Afro-Africa, comme d'habitude, nous serons toujours là pour vous servir. Nous profitons de l'occasion ici également pour plaider pour votre soutien parce que nous en avons besoin. Nous nous adressons à la diaspora africaine qui nous suit depuis et pourquoi pas les amis du monde qui nous regardent. Nous avons besoin de votre soutien. Faites un tour sur monafriquetv.net. Essayez d'apporter votre soutien par notre boîte de donation. Donnez quelque chose. Essayez de nous aider à garder ce programme. Il en a vraiment besoin. Nous commençons à vraiment ressentir le poids et le coût de ce que cela nous demande pour améliorer l'information et pour mieux vous servir. Nous plaidons donc pour votre bonne compréhension et surtout pour votre soutien à cette nouvelle chaîne de télévision qui a pour but et seul but de servir la diaspora et le continent africain pour la communication. Doudou Teclin Goulet, c'est mon nom. Comme d'habitude, votre servante auditrice, je serai toujours là pour vous servir avec votre soutien, bien sûr. Restez connectés et à bientôt. Au revoir. Merci. Bye.
And I think during, stories like Sandy, instead of it was a legitimate story showing the white guy who wouldn't let the African American woman in, help her with her children, but also showing people who are helping each other cross-culturally. I think those are the ways that we remind our audience that there are more connections than there are divisions.
I just don't want us to be too naive about, look, I love white men, straight white men. They mentored me because, frankly, I was a lawyer at a major law firm, and then I ran litigation for Apple Computer. And I was mentored by straight white men because I always tell young people, if you aren't a lesbian, just say you are, because they love mentoring. They think we're 14-year-old boys, and that the work they're mentoring, and it takes all the tension away, and you actually advance very quickly if you're a lesbian. But let's step back and look at law firms, which is what I know, and we can look at the corporate structure of the media. Of the 200 top law firms in this country, 0.05 have, that's the number of women partners of color, non-white, have a different color than white and have estrogen. That's the number. If you look at Viacom and you look at various corporations, it is heavily controlled and dominated still today, and with huge amounts of money at the top. Like, how many swimming pools do you need? I mean, you can only be in one at a time. So I don't think we should be naive about the massive gap between the haves, which are largely, almost uniformly, white straight men. It's a fact of life. And the rest of the country, and it's a fact. And so the issue is what happens as history rolls forward, and will there indeed be a slow sort of distribution of power and authority that changes into the hands of others? We have lots of women graduating from college, but they fall off in most corporate settings at year 7. They opt out. because the very nature of how we've defined work doesn't take into account that they have brains and a womb. We forgot. They have both. And we haven't redefined work in a way that will allow women to sort of succeed and do all the great things they're able to do. We don't define it that way. So I just don't want us to think, boy, it's amazing how we have all this power now that's been distributed in this really beautiful mosaic, because we're not there yet.
We have 3 international questions, right? And so let's take the first one.
How can mainstream media gain readership in minority communities such as societies become more diverse? Should such efforts be reflected in its main pages to increase awareness, or should they be spun into affiliate editorial products to target specific groups? What are the risks of either?
To mainstream versus affiliate groups, I think the answer is both. Time Warner has like some phenomenal products that are specifically geared toward niche communities, people in Espanol, which is gente, by the way, and also Essence Magazine and various niche communities. But there's also been tremendous efforts, I think, not just specific to this company, but media companies at large, to make sure that the pages, particularly people in English, to reflect a greater kind of like a greater diversity of like the people that they're talking to and the celebrities that are covered. And so I think that there's opportunities in both to gain readership, because at the end of the day, it's not a business opportunity, which I think a lot of media companies are recognizing and trying out new ways to figure out what that best way is, because since the model of what's always worked within our business has changed, I think the innovation and opportunity is, while you're looking at a different model and a different strategy, you also have the opportunity to make sure that other voices that haven't traditionally been a part of that coverage or a part of that conversation are also involved more fully.
And I do think they do a better job of diversifying its pages. I think in news coverage, we have a ways to go. And I think if I'm constantly finding myself in stories about crime, dependency, victimhood, after a while, and I speak for many people, we just stop reading. We stop watching. So I think until we manage to flesh out that picture and show people doing some everyday things, and they're just, as I alluded to earlier, there are easy ways to do it. We know we're going to do the back to school stories every year, and men of color take their kids back to school. We know Christmas, Valentine's Day, everyday stories. And until we do that, I think because there are other places where I can now go for my news that is more reflective of my reality, if mainstream organizations don't begin to weave those stories in, they're going to continue to lose market share in communities of color, which are the fastest growing communities. So I think that there's a real danger if we don't start to begin to look at the reality of communities of color instead of the distorted picture that we're showing.
That there's a major problem that we have now, and it's a problem of retribalization, kind of the high-tech version of what's happening in the Middle East. When I was a kid, we had 3 flavors of ice cream and three television networks, and everybody in the country watched I Love Lucy on Tuesday night. We live in the golden age. If we live in the golden age of anything, it's the golden age of marketing. And now we have 1,000 niche channels, and there are, and there are different tribes. My dad was a member of the ESPN tribe. My daughter's a member of the MTV tribe. I'm obviously a member of the CNN C-SPAN tribe. And to me, the greater challenge is where we find common ground. Where do we all get together? Because when I talk to politicians, when I talk to political leaders, and I'm sure that if Mohammed Morsi were sitting here right now, they say that the greatest challenge to them is to find a common audience.
And then there were pictures coming from Egypt, never got, again, major coverage, of Muslim women with the head cover lowering water from their buildings to the Christians going in the funeral and giving them water to drink out of buckets. It was incredible, something you don't normally see, but that didn't get the coverage. Those are, I think, amazing stories that we need much more to cover.
death of traditional journalism, but we're living in an era of the great democratization of journalism, where you can have
Well, we went from
many
one,
outlets.
we've gone from one extreme and we're heading toward another, and being a flaming moderate, I always hope for something. And a focus group out in Iowa that didn't include a single evangelical, who were assumed to be all behind one candidate. Who was it that year? It might have been Pat Robertson. I then went to an evangelical church and did a focus group of my own and found people supporting 4 different candidates. They have to be in the room too.
Well, I don't think you also want to exclude anybody. I think you're right. Everybody needs to be at
And,
the table.
and if you talk to them, that is their major gripe with the media, that they're not included.
And they're right, because there was a story done by, in the San Francisco Chronicle, by a young woman who was dying, and she did a series, and she talked often about prayer, and she was evangelical, and I got to know her through the course of the series, and I started to think, why does it usually make me uncomfortable when people would talk about prayer and that sort of, and I realized because just as with African Americans we have certain leaders, with evangelical we have Pat Robertson and Jimmy.
Well, Pat Robertson, can I just defend
But,
Pat? He's
just-
Catholic. He's
but,
not evangelical.
Okay, but just in the terms of how we cover
Right.
religion, we have these set leaders and we're not going to everyday people, and it has the same distorting effect.
I would just add, I went to actually an evangelical Bible college, so I can represent them here. And I did a biblical studies there.
It's amazing how diverse this panel is.
And it is, and I'll tell you what, it was amazing. In my life experience, I always like to put myself in the places where I'm very uncomfortable and see how crazy it will get. I was studying in this evangelical Bible college and working in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. There was the only Palestinian involved. And it was an amazing experience. It was definitely uncomfortable in the beginning, but it was an amazing experience. And that
Amazing good or amazing bad?
Amazing good. I learned so much from them. There were moments I wanted to punch something. But I learned how to listen when people say stuff I totally disagree with. But I learned also to appreciate the good that they had that I didn't know. I know much more about I argue with my Israeli liberal friends about the ultra-Orthodox community because I end up being the one defending them, and they find it always hilarious. But by doing that, I was able to understand where they're coming from and represent them in my writing and my speaking a lot better and be able to reach out to them. We talked about evangelical Christians. I probably spoke at like hundreds of those around the U.S., from West Virginia to Texas to Georgia to everywhere around the U.S., have been working with some of them to take them on trips to the Middle East that are focused. I took a group from Washington here from an evangelical church that went to Egypt to spend time with the Salafis and the Brotherhood and do dialogue with them. And so you are right. I think often we can marginalize groups that think that they are already the majority, and it's a big mistake. And we have to spend time to understand that these communities are much more diverse than we think they are, just like the African American community or just like the Arab communities. There's much more diversity that we have to bring in our stories and how we talk about things. I was in Jerusalem filming for National Geographic, a web series, and we're trying to figure out how do you do that, because there's so many stories, so you put them all together. And what we decided to do then was separate a lot of those and bring each people's story, just let them tell it. So whether it's the settlers, the army, the refugees, the people who protest. And by doing that, we were able to bring in not just one voice of each. We're, spend a lot of time with the Israeli army, bringing so many voices from there, bringing so many voices from the Palestinian refugees that people think these guys think only as a one unit, and they don't.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, but I do want to go to questions from the audience.
I do think that it is important to go very deep into a story, and the funny part about Pat Robertson, I interviewed him once and I was on a few times with him on CNN. He's a working class Catholic, a little bit of charismatic experience, but not Protestant born again Christian, like not by a long shot. and that's Jerry Falwell. So it's like, the delightful result, sometimes when you go deeper, is we found one piece of common ground. And that's that, as a marginalized lesbian, the gay people are even marginalized in their own family. When they go home, their family's different. But, Pat Robertson, as a Catholic in America, sometimes felt marginalized. So on that one little tiny piece of strip of land, we found that common connection. But he's far from born again. And, same with Mitt Romney. It's like he's like from a different planet compared to a born-again evangelical Christian.
Okay, questions for me?
I work with Charlie Erickson, who started Hispanic Link because there were no voices. And I think we see ourselves as a gateway to the many voices of the different communities. But I wanted to make 3 bullet points because I could speak for 40 years of work in this area.
There also should be a question involved.
There is. I would like your comments. The impact of having a journalism profession right now that's not up to par. Bristol Myers, I wasn't going to say it, but about 7 years ago, the chief of marketing called me. He'd heard about my background, and he asked me, he said, "Blacks and Hispanics get AIDS?" I'm stunned, and he wasn't kidding. And he wanted me to volunteer as a senior executive to help them redo their platform. That's what happens when the media coverage is not inclusive. The National Press Club, it took me a year to get Juan Gonzalez as a speaker here on his beautiful book on 200 Years of Racism in the Media. The audience was not packed with mainstream journalists. So how do we, one, educate mainstream journalists that they have to be educated on issues like healthcare in the different communities? And number 2, how do we gain the inclusiveness and be a gateway to community voices, not a representative in that sense? And one comment. Facebook, supposedly, the number, tens of thousands of Palestinians and Israelis are connecting on Facebook every month. So that is one. But my question is, how do we make this applied learning, implied intelligence, and make the change not at the media only, but how it affects corporations, governments, and the community?
My question is a bit impertinent. One of the things I've been hearing you guys talk about diversity, right? We've been codifying diversity as differences in color. My own sort of the criteria by which I'd like to measure diversity for this question is diversity of opinion, right? I heard you say Joe, I heard you say when you looked around the room, you saw diversity. Diversity of that sort in the United States I find more common than is diversity of opinion. It's gotten to the point where I truthfully am thinking of leaving the country because I don't feel like there's freedom of expression here anymore. So when that happens,
Where? To go to what island of freedom of expression on the face of the earth?
I don't know yet.
Oh, okay.
I know it's getting bad over here to the point where it's certainly restrictive of my ability to speak what I believe to be correct. But it gets to the point where you can say, if I'm quoting you correctly, the words were a stern and restrictive return to Islam, which my own training is in Islamic movements in Pakistan. That is not correct. You also, in my opinion, you also said there is, when people are not going to university, they're throwing rocks. It's, at least in Pakistan, I don't purport to know much more than that. It's usually student movements that are doing that, not the people out of university. So this idea that there's, that a person who happens to be a member of the community is in fact representing a differing opinion from the majority community, I don't buy into that very strongly. How do you think that we're working to include diversity of opinions that counter what we think of as standard narrative or as correct? How do you think we should go about doing that?
My name is Dudu Tekle Ngule. I represent Afro-Africa Media here in the United States. We're based in Maryland. I've been here for 10 years. My question is that since I've been in school in Virginia as a journalist, we're speaking about diversity, but looking around here in the media, we feel like American media do not really focus on African community diaspora living here. The only time you can see Africa on TV in America is when they go and shot people are poor, they are sick. Is there not journalists here that can be turning around and speak about African diaspora in United States, telling the story about African living in the United States, because we are thousands of African living here. After the India people, African diaspora are the second intellectual in United States, and nobody really talk about it.
Okay.
So my question is, do African continent does not interest journalists in United States, or what is the problem?
I don't want to be cynical, but because Africa is an expanding market, and it's one of the fastest growing continent in the world, and that has increased the interest and understanding. I just wanted to say one thing, as people are asking, please go back to your heads of etc. Please be nice to the gay people, no matter where you're from. If you're from Egypt, if you're from Saudi Arabia, if you're from 7 of the nations around the world where you can be stoned to death, I'm just saying, be nice, okay?
Let's take the last question.
And I'm CEO of Roots of Peace, and I'm based in San Francisco, California. I'd like to thank the panelists for their astute comments as we close this meeting. I take out landmines around the world, and there's 70 million landmines in 70 countries. I turn mines to vines, replacing the scourge of landmines with the nectar of grapes. December 3rd was the 15th anniversary of the signing of the Ottawa Treaty to ban landmines. I approach this from a humanitarian standpoint. I'm a mother of 4 children. I'm $100 million under contract in Afghanistan, funded by USAID, USDA, DOD, European Union, and the World Bank. I work in 34 of the 34 provinces, and I witnessed, when I was there, boots on the ground in August, a harvest of hope where women and men are growing alternative agricultural crops to poppies and thriving. Tomorrow, this is my son, Tucker Kuhn. He's country director of Vietnam, 3.5 million landmines 35 years after the war has ended. There is no peace on earth when there are landmines in the ground. I salute my son for living in Vietnam for the past 2 years. 2 years working in Quang Tri province, the 17th parallel, planting peppers where the land is still hot. 87% of the land still unspeakable. Women, children, innocent footsteps. Tomorrow I depart for Israel. I will be greeted by a darling little boy. I was at his bar mitzvah. His name is Daniel Yuval. He was with his family in this rare snowball fight in the Golan. He accidentally stepped on a landmine at age 11 on February 6, 2010. I went to his bedside. I promised him I would be the voice on behalf of mothers and children around the world who have no voice here today.
This is
over the wall, the field, the rainbow, to Bethlehem. Bethlehem, I'd just like to bring into the consciousness, is in Palestine. I've raised the private funds to demine the fields of Bethlehem, which will begin this month. My question is this fertile grounds for peace in the Middle East to help remove an estimated 1.5 million landmines in both Israel and West Bank, and to create an opportunity for peace on earth during this December of Hanukkah, Christmas, and the celebration of peace on earth. That is my question.
I think it's great, and I've followed these stories. I know people who've been affected as well, and I think these are stories, as we mentioned earlier, that we need more to report on it and to bring it more to life. So I commend your work. I think it's very important. And not many people know about how many mines are left. I mean, especially if you go to areas like the Golan Heights, you cannot walk anywhere. I found myself in the middle of a minefield because there were no signs before, and it was pretty scary. So I totally support what you do.
So I think in any institution, it's how do you build a deliberative process that allows for the kind of discourse that you're talking about, allows for the debate, allows for dissection. And inclusive means, if you don't have representation that's different, then there's no point to being inclusive, because you're getting uniformity of opinion, experience, background, class to me is one of the most important differentiators, but in order to build it, you have to build it. And it is a very slow, careful process. Every single hiring decision makes a difference.
That's
and
right.
you have to have panels, you have to have competition. And, you know, we talked about affirmative action, but I think that's a very unique kind of animal of sort of the US experience. But if you're in India and you don't have eventually someone from, say, the lowest caste, you're not going to get every voice. And every country is going to have its version of the multiplicity of perspectives that you need to get at the authenticity and truth of a story.
In building the organization and choosing the people that are part of that, because having a seat at the table matters, being in the room matters, and there's more conversations that are decided in the back rooms that most people aren't aware of that change the face of the organization and how things are run. But in corporations, there seem to be more ambiguity around diversity in business goals than there are for things that are straight T&Ls, like in terms of like, you know, or P&Ls, like profits and loss. And I think that if you can get really kind of finite in what you're trying to do, like we are going to be the organization of the future that is representative of America, which the Army did and has, you know, parity to population in their organization. If we have that kind of like goal that we're working toward in an era and in a time where we're reevaluating our business and how we're doing things anyway, oftentimes we have these general discussions about diversity, which can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It means something probably different talking to you than someone else. When I went to the University of Missouri, as a girl who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, it was a very diverse place. But to people who had moved from rural areas of Missouri, it was hugely diverse. So I think that one, just kind of starting from the same place of specificity and either what the goal is for a business or what the goal is editorially, and what you're trying to do really helps, and to get there. But you know, to your point, I think it's having those partners with the various affiliates as well and trying to kind of reach those goals. So when you talked about the Bristol Myers Squibb, I think the company calling and mentioning that to you, I know there's been a lot written around AIDS and you know, the Black community very specifically, and the Washington Post has covered it, you know, extensively well specific to that. But I mean, sometimes it is a matter of making sure that those within the communities that you're serving are aware of that as well. And so I think specificity in what you're trying to reach and do, and so you can name it and claim it, so to speak, you know, get to that goal, but also kind of like partnering with those affiliates. Does that help with that last question? I know you had two others beforehand.
I was talking about inclusive. This is Juliet Schmidt, and I'm the director of the Partners in Humanity program at Search for Common Ground. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Common Ground News Service, and so we try precisely to get these types of stories out into the media, and the articles are free to reprint by any news outlet, which of course with American exclusivity is difficult in the US. But my question is, I hate terms like talking about the media and the media is not doing well, politicians aren't doing well. The journalists, I mean, they really want to report on these things properly. They want to do, I mean, and this is just professional journalism. We're not asking for, you know, for a bias or for a unique perspective. I mean, it's professional journalism to talk about all the stakeholders in a story. So how can we best equip individual journalists who are really busy, who often can't take a day or 2 days away from their job to attend a training? How do we equip them with the tools and resources to make it easier for them to do this with the budget constraints and the time constraints and the editorial constraints they're already facing?
That right now, having done this for over 40 years and seen the transformation of journalism from what it was when Bob Maynard's walked the earth to what it is now, the commercial pressures are so enormous. It becomes so hard. Journalists are now having to do a lot more than we ever did before. I used to be able to just write a column a week. Now I have to blog every day as well. And so I think that the real threshold point is for those who are hiring journalists, hiring new journalists. You want to be able to hire people who are smart and sensitive. And you know, and I think that we have to pay a great deal of attention to that, and not just go with the resume, you know, or the college that they attended. I'm right now, speaking of mentoring, I'm now mentoring a young woman at Time, who graduated of the University of Missouri, who is going to be a spectacular journalist. And it's up to us, especially those of us who are in the, you know, the near emeritus status, to try and select for those, because it is so hard now.
I think you made a very good point, though, that I think we should all remember, which is that journalists don't wake up every day to do a bad job. They wake up every day to do the best job they can. And I think that's something that we need to celebrate and recognize, and then ask people to be a little bit more deliberate, because you don't know what you don't know. So think about, what does this story look across race? What does it look like across class? And try to use some of the new tools to get some more insight. Try to make sure that your Twitter stream is as diverse as possible.
Yes. And one of the very kind of specific solutions logistically, I know that helps me, is people don't know what they're asking for. Being very specific. You don't want to miss this story. This is the story in a sentence. You know, just oftentimes even something as simple as that in a pitch is really helpful.
Let me just say in closing that this is the third program that I've done for the Alliance of Civilizations. And the bottom line is always the same. At the first one, we were talking about the Middle East, and there were some intemperate comments about Arabs by several of the Israeli questioners. You remember that? Yeah. And what I said then is what I believe now as the answer to all of these problems. And it's kind of remarkable given the fact of the history of the Jewish people, but since that wall was built, there's been, and even given the tiny patch of turf we're talking about, many Israelis have been able to dehumanize the Arabs. You know, I spend as much time in the West Bank as I do in Israel. I know how extraordinary the Palestinian people are. But then I find that whenever I spend time with anyone, and I would say that what's the work we have to do going forward is spend more time with people of other persuasions. The next meeting of African American journalists, you should think about inviting some Tea Party people and just expose them. You know, same is true, you know, the same is true with all of these communities. Because it has been my experience as a New Yorker and as a journalist that being with people who are different from you is one of the most exhilarating and wonderful experiences in life. It's the quickest path to true education, and it is the basis of our common humanity. And I will leave it with that. Thanks.
I think we owe another round of applause to all of our panelists.
C'était dans la fin de cette conférence. Merci de nous avoir suivis. Comme d'habitude, pour que ces bonnes auditrices restent connectées à Africa TV. Votre support est plus que la bienvenue pour la continuité de ce programme. Je vous Claire Ngoulet, c'est mon nom. Au revoir et à bientôt. Merci.